Alrighty, last Sunday, Josh went over chapter 17 in our study of the book of Acts. We seen, well, at least y'all seen, because I wasn't here last Sunday, but where Paul, he would have went to Thessalonica, and for 3 Sabbaths, he would have went there reasoning with the Jews there. And it would say that afterwards, as he would reason for those 3 Sabbath days, that eventually some Jews would have believed, along with a large number of the Greeks and leading women. But all wouldn't believe, for we know that some of the Jews would have became jealous. And as they would have became jealous, they would have went and they would have attacked the house of Jason in hopes to find Paul. And after this would have occurred, that the brethren, they would have sent Paul to Berea. And what do we know about the Bereans that was significant about them? What was something that was really interesting that they did? They studied the word daily. They searched the scriptures daily. And it says that they were more noble than those in Thessalonica because they did that. And after they did that, we see that they would have believed because they searched the scriptures. And that's obviously a point for us to make. Don't just take my word for it, but take God's word for it and look and see what thus saith the Lord. And so after this would have occurred, the Jews from Thessalonica would have heard that Paul would have carried the gospel to the Bereans. And so they would travel over to Berea and they would stir up the crowds there to kind of make a commotion there. And so afterwards, we see that Paul, the brethren would have escorted Paul to Athens. And in Athens, he would have preached in the synagogue, in the marketplace, and later on he would preach a sermon on Mars Hill. And afterwards, the conclusion we read in verse 32 of Acts chapter 17. It will say that now when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some began to sneer, but others said, we shall hear you again concerning this. So Paul went out of their midst, but some men joined him and believed, among whom also were Dionysius the Areopagite, and a woman named Damaris, and others with them. And we begin our lesson in verse 1 of Acts chapter 18. It will say, after these things, he left Athens and went to Corinth. Now, here we have a map here concerning the travel that Paul would have. Well, that's not working. But Paul would have traveled over to Corinth from Athens, and it would have been about 50 miles southwest. And the city of Corinth, it was significant for a couple reasons. Am I doing something wrong?
Well, it's not turned on.
Oh, see, I turned.
There we go.
Thank you. All right. There you go. All right. So we see the travel that Paul would have conducted. He would have went from Athens to Corinth, which again would have been about 50 miles to the southwest. And when he would get there, but before we move forward, we're going to look at the city of Corinth. It would have been rebuilt on the ruins of the past by Julius Caesar in 46 BC. And what was significant about it is that it lay in between the Adriatic Sea on the west and the Aegean Sea on to the east, and which made it an important commercial city. It would have had a population of roughly around 500,000, maybe more, depending on the amount of slaves that they had there. And it wasn't just important because it had this commercial center. It wasn't just important that it was the capital of the province of Achaia, but the city of Corinth was known for their immorality. We look at cities today like Las Vegas, and we consider that, Sin City or the city of sin. Mainly they're known for their great casinos and all, their practice in greed and all those different things. And in other places, you have the prostitution going on in there. When you look at the term Sin City, we can kind of see that here in the city of Corinth, as it was known to be of great immorality there. You look at it being the lowest of the low, that they would have been renowned for their wickedness, for their immorality. There's an expression that will say, that if something is Corinthianized, then that would have been equal to it being immoral. And so it was a really bad thing, what the Corinthians were doing. And you see, one of the things that they practiced, many people there, they practiced the worship of they worshiped the Greek goddess Aphrodite. And Aphrodite, I believe she was known as the goddess of beauty and fertility, if I'm not mistaken. And the people that would worship her, they would have had this temple that once claimed the adornment of 1,000 sacred prostitutes, or whatever that means. But we see that this city of sin, this city of Corinth was an immoral place. And so Paul is here in this place. And as he is here, it says in verse 2 that he would have met a Jew by the name Aquila. It says that Aquila would have been from Pontus, and his wife Aquila, his wife Priscilla, I get those mixed up, but his wife Priscilla would have been there with him. And you wonder why they are all the way here in the city of Corinth. I mean, you see on the map, they're all the way here in Rome, and they travel all the way to Corinth. And the reason for that, if you look in verse 2 in the latter part, it says, that they recently came from Italy, that Aquila recently came from Italy with his wife Priscilla because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. And so we see that they're originally over there in Rome, but they had to leave because of something that Claudius did. Now, we may ask the question, well, why did Claudius make this decree? Why did Claudius want the Jews out of Rome? And then, mind you, it would have been roughly 20,000 Jews that would have had to make this move. And so as all these Jews are here, and they were moved out of Rome, we understand, if we look at Suetonius, he's one historian that kind of gives us an explanation of why Claudius would have moved all of these Jews out of Rome. Suetonius, he explains that the Jews would have had continued making disturbances at the instigation of the term Chrestus. And Chrestus, many historians, many scholars take this as a reference to Jewish and Christian conflict going about Christ. So the Jews are causing all these different disturbances about this Chrestus thing going on. And pretty much Claudius, he's sick of it. And so he's saying, look, get out and go. And so that's why we see Aquila and Priscilla here. And we see that Paul, at first, when he gets here, he's lonely. He's doing all this preaching, but he doesn't really know anybody until he really gets there to talk with Aquila and Priscilla. You look at Aquila, he's a Jew. And so that would have helped Paul out in having someone to talk with, to relate with. And who's to say that Aquila and Priscilla were converted? It doesn't say anything about Paul going to them and speaking to them to where, they ended up believing the gospel. They probably was already converted. Now, we don't know, but that could have been the case. But we see that Paul, he would have made his abode with them, that they would have been of the same trade, being tent makers. They would have been Jews. And so he stays there. And so he's working with them. And in verse 4, it says that he would have went to the synagogues every Sabbath, trying to persuade the Jews and the Greeks. And we understand that working, tent making, is probably a busy job. To the point where he wasn't always available, he wasn't always able to preach and give himself wholeheartedly to preaching the gospel. But it says that every Sabbath he would do this until we get to verse 5. It would say in verse 5, but when Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, Paul began devoting himself completely to the word, solemnly testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. And the reason for this being, if you remember in Acts chapter 17, verse 14, Paul and Timothy and Silas, they would have been left in Berea. It says in verse 14, then immediately the brethren sent Paul out to go as far as the sea, and Silas and Timothy remained there. So they're still in Berea up until we see in verse 5 that they finally catch up with Paul. And here it says that after that would have happened, that Paul began devoting himself completely to the word. And one reason for that, we look in passages like 2 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, you don't have to turn there, but in verse 9, we can kind of allude that as Timothy and Silas would have came there to meet Paul, that they would have offered some support. In verse 9 of 2 Corinthians chapter 11, it was saying, when I was present with you, this is Paul talking to the church at Corinth. He says, and when I was present with you and was in need, I was not a burden to anyone. For when the brethren came from Macedonia, they fully supplied my need. So we see that Paul here, he's not taking anything from the brethren here in Corinth, or even those that were in Corinth, but he says that Timothy and Silas would have came from Macedonia, and we can kind of conclude there that they would have supported Paul with what the brethren at Macedonia would have given him. And so here he devotes himself completely to preaching the word of God. That it's not probably just on the Sabbath, but he's probably doing this every day. Now that he doesn't really have to focus so much on tent making, which would have been a tedious process. And after he does this, it says pretty much after that, the Jews would have resisted and blasphemed. And so after they would have done this, that Paul would then go to the Gentiles. It says that he would have shook his garments, and we know that he did this a couple other times, mainly taking the dust off his feet. But he says that he would have done this, and he says, look, I'm going to the Gentiles. And we see in verse 7, he says, then he left there and went to the house of a man named Titius Justus, a worshiper of God whose house was next to the synagogue. And it would have been likely that as Paul would have came to the Gentiles, that this was one of the Gentiles here whose house was literally next door to the synagogue. And so he is here, and it's likely that he used his place as a classroom. And for any devout Jew that would have wanted to hear the message, they probably would have came there and listened to Paul. One being Crispus. In verse 8, it says, Crispus, the leader of the synagogue, who was obviously a Jew, he says that he believed in the Lord with all his household. And not only that, but in many of the Corinthians, when they heard, were believing and being baptized. Now, why was this so significant to the Corinthians? I mean, we're seeing all these people in our past studies that were obedient to the gospel call, and that is important. But why is this the case for the Corinthians? What do we say, or what do we learn about the Corinthians and how they conducted things? Well, if you remember, the Corinthians, they were known to be that sin city. They were immoral. They were the lowest of the low, if you will. And so this is a big thing specifically for the Corinthians, that they're obeying the gospel. That the lowest of the low even was saved. And that kind of just give us the point that the power of the gospel can save anyone who chooses to hear and put their faith in Jesus. You look at cities today, that consider themselves a part of the Bible Belt. Whether it be the cities that are part of the Bible Belt or whether it be sin cities. The gospel can reach all. It's the power of God to salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. And looking at verse 9, after this is the case, it says, and the Lord said to Paul in the night by a vision, do not be afraid any longer, but go on speaking and do not be silent. For I am with you, and no man will attack you in order to harm you. For I have many people in this city. And as I was reading this, I was kind of confused, if you will. After you see all these people, they're obeying the gospel call. It says the next verse that Paul was afraid. If anything, this should have encouraged Paul to continue on and continue to preach and do God's will. But we see that the Lord would have had to encourage Paul. And the question I have for you are, what may be some reasons why Paul would have been afraid, would have been, worried about what's going on, to the point where he's probably silent? Why was this the case? Anybody have any?
He could have been afraid that he wasn't being effective, especially with the Jews.
Yeah, definitely. I'm learning that today, trying to go out and preach, and, when it's not as effective, it kind of, gets me to, should I keep doing this? Thank you for that. Anyone else? JD?
I see he could have been afraid of having a lot of success, and the
Yeah, no, definitely. Because we see, all the persecution going on every time, a church is established or the gospel is spreading, and the Jews, they get jealous. It's like something always happens to Paul, and Paul's like, man, I can't keep going through this. And so he may be discouraged, but because of that, we see that whether it be the persecution to the church, we know from 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 28, that this is one of his worries, that he was always worrying about the churches. He says, apart from such external things, there is the daily pressure on me of concern for all the churches. So he's probably worrying about all the churches, and that this church in particular, that the Jews may come and, they may try to break things up here. And we know that Paul would have had a love for the churches. You look in verse 8, one that would have most likely been added to this church was one that Paul would have baptized. It says that Crispus, the leader of the synagogue, believed in the Lord with all his household. And the reason why I say that, if you look in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, and in verse 1, it says that Paul, called as an apostle of Jesus Christ by the will of God, and Sosthenes, our brother, and I went ahead. But Crispus, it said that he would have been one that Paul would have baptized. Actually, it's in 2 Corinthians chapter 11. I believe 2 Corinthians chapter 11. Where is it? I am. 1 Corinthians, I done lost it. Thank you for that. 2 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians 1:14. Yes. Thank you for that. I get those mixed up. In verse 14, it says, I thank God that I baptized none of you except Crispus and Gaius. And so we see that Paul would have probably had he would have had a love for the church, especially people that he would have baptized himself. And there probably would have been persecution that would have been going on that he was really worried about. So it's either that or even with persecution to himself, as we kind of talked about. That Paul, he says in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 3, he says, look, I was with you in weakness and in fear and in much trembling. We often look at Paul and say, man, he is bold. He's just continuing on. But here, he's been weak. He's fearful. And even what Jesus has to encourage him and say, look, continue on. Do not be silent, but speak, for I am with you. And it says in verse 10, and no man will attack you in order to harm you. He has to tell him, look, no one's going to attack you. So just continue on. Why? For I have many people in this city. It's kind of important to look at this because Sin City, again, city of Corinth. But Jesus says that he has many people in this city. And so that's pretty interesting to look at. Yes, sir.
Well, I think verse 6 kind of sums it up when it says, but when they opposed him and blasphemed, he shook his garments and said to them, your blood be on your own heads. It seems like the division and the conflict is coming from the Jews.
Yeah.
Because he says, you're guilty of the blood of Christ, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing that he would say in Acts 20 when he says, I'm innocent of the blood of all men. He goes back to Ezekiel 33 and the watchmen of Israel. If you see the enemy coming and you warn the people and they don't listen, it's on them.
Yes, sir.
Previous chapter, he said that God has appointed a day in which he's going to judge the world in righteousness. So he has warned them of what's coming. They've rejected it, and he says, your blood is on your own heads.
Yes, sir.
They blaspheme and hate you because of it.
Yeah. Just going back to what we were talking about, I think it was last week, we were saying it's the same message, but, different people, they take it differently. So Brother Steve was pretty much going back to Exodus chapter 33, where it was talking about, if someone is coming, that you ought to warn them of that. If you don't warn them, it's, blood is on your hands. But if you do warn them and they don't do anything about it, then the blood is on their hands. And here we see Paul, he is telling them of Jesus. He is speaking about Jesus, but they go on to blaspheme And so he shakes the garments off he shakes his garments and he would say, the blood is on your hands. I am not guilty for you because I've warned you. And so we see that there. Any more questions or comments? Mm-hmm.
He was being strong and bold. And could this vision not have been just an encouragement saying, continue like you're doing. I'm going to protect you, not to comfort him with fear, but to give him encouragement to continue the way that he's going?
Yes, ma'am. Yeah, it's a possibility. I guess the way I just look at it here, I just see in verse 10, he's telling them, in verse 9, he says, don't be afraid any longer. And that's pretty much denoting that he was afraid. But maybe he did need.
Not all versions use that, though. Not all versions include don't be afraid any longer, because mine doesn't say that.
Oh, what does yours say?
Mine says, do not be afraid. That's
Huh.
It's not to get too nerdy, it's in the verb tense, and so some translations will give what the verb tense is. The any longer, I think, is implied in the word itself, but
I'm just struggling a bit with Paul being afraid to do the will of God. Well, that's my struggle.
The only problem, if scripturally, if you look at the history, when God tells somebody, whether it be Abraham or Isaac or whoever it is, the apostles in John the 14th chapter, let not your heart be troubled. They are facing some kind of challenge in their life, and he reassures them, like Joshua the first chapter, that I'm with you, I won't depart from you, you'll be able to overcome this. And so for him to say, don't be afraid, I think Paul was afraid of something. Or at least the Lord thought he was afraid of something, or should be afraid of something.
Yeah. I had to get back with y'all on that. But what I was under the impression was that he was afraid. And going on, it would say that Jesus would have to tell him, but go on speaking and do not be silent. Now, I don't think he was just always silent, but he does need that encouragement there. But that's pretty much what I have on that. Any more questions or comments? And so after he has this encouragement by Jesus, to say to go on preaching, he gives him that confidence and that encouragement there. It says that in verse 11, and he settled there 1 year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. So he would continue on, and we all need encouragement. And what better encouragement from the Lord himself? So looking at verse 12, we're going to go ahead and read that. It says, but Gallio was proconsul of Achaia. The Jews with one accord, but while Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews with one accord rose up against Paul and brought him before the judgment seat, saying, this man persuades man to worship God contrary to the law. Now, before we move forward there, we know that Gallio, it says that he was a proconsul of Achaia, and this would have been around AD 51. He would have been a brother of Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, and he was known as a charming and witty fellow. It says that he, again, was the proconsul, and we see that he's not the first proconsul we see here. Back in Acts chapter 13, Sergius Paulus, that he was another proconsul of this senatorial province there. And so this is Gallio. We see him. It says that the Jews would have brought Paul, and this is the picture we have here, but the Jews would have brought Paul before the judgment seat. Now, the judgment seat would have been about 7.5 feet above where the assembly would have been. And so that's pretty much that brick right there, the ruins of it. And then if you're looking at that mountain, that's, if I'm not mistaken, where the temple where they would have worshipped Aphrodite would have been. And so Paul is really here in that midsection there, and they're bringing him up for judgment. And the thing that the Jews were accusing him of was this man, verse 13, this man persuades men to worship God contrary to the law. So they're pretty much going up to Gallio saying, look, he's not doing things according to how our religion goes. But we know that Claudius, he would have gave an answer that probably would have surprised them. We know before times that people like Pontius Pilate, he would have kind of dipped his affairs in religion, in the things that the Jews would have had problems with. But we see this is not the case for Gallio. He says this in verse 14. But when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, if it were a matter of wrong or a vicious crime, O Jews, it would be reasonable for me to put up with you. But if there are questions about words and names and your own law, look after it yourselves. I am unwilling to be a judge of these matters. So pretty much Claudius here, or not Claudius, Gallio here, he would say that, look, leave this for yourself. I'm not a judge of these things. If it was something like a misdemeanor or a felony, then I would listen to you then. But this is just something according to your religion. You see to it yourself, pretty much. And so Gallio gives this answer. And we see that this answer probably would have been something that the Jews would have not liked at all. It says afterwards, after he would have drove them away from the judgment seat, in verse 17, it says, and they all took hold of Sosthenes, the leader of the synagogue, and began beating him in front of the judgment seat. But Gallio was not concerned about any of these things. Now, concerning this Sosthenes character, it says that he was a leader of the synagogue. And after the Jews would have been drove away from the judgment seat, it says that Sosthenes was beat. Now, there's different things going on about who beat Sosthenes here. It probably would have been the Jews because they were upset that, they didn't get the answer they wanted. And so they beat Sosthenes for not doing what he needed to do, being the leader of the synagogue. And others may say that it may be the Greeks, it may be the lictors that would have just beat Sosthenes, the leader of the synagogue, because they just had animosity for the Jews. So we don't really know who beat Sosthenes, but I guess it was a good thing for it, because afterwards we see in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, which is what I skipped to earlier, but in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, it seems that Sosthenes was led to the truth. It says in verse 1 of 1 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul, called as an apostle of Jesus Christ by the will of God, and Sosthenes, our brother. And so, not many people we know named Sosthenes in the Bible here, so it kind of alludes to that this possibly might be the same person that was beat in Acts chapter 18. Any questions before we move forward? Yeah.
This was really, when you think about it, a really, really important legal judicial decision that was just made as far as the spread of the gospel in Rome.
Mm-hmm.
And the class material really brings it out very well, but it made it really legal. If Rome had thought that Christianity was, quote, a new religion, that would have been a different story, and the spread of gospel could have been curtailed a little bit. But this is an important decision that's being made here. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. No, it was definitely an important decision because it allowed Paul to continue on to preach. If anything, if Gallio's answer would have been something different, and at the point to where Paul was in prison for, it would have, probably hindered. I won't say hindered the gospel because we know it's going to continue on even in imprisonment. But it would have been some trouble here. But it kind of goes back to what Jesus had told him when he gave him that encouragement and said, look, continue on because I have many people here. And it's funny because when it said Jesus tells him that no one is going to harm you here, that is the case. That is, he is not harmed, but rather the leader of the synagogue, Sosthenes, is harmed. So that's pretty interesting there. Thank you for that. Any other questions or comments before we move forward? Yes, ma'am? Mhm.
Christians, you know, maybe that was something that was haunting him as well. It doesn't say, but
Yeah.
I mean,
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
it's for him to be afraid.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, you look at Jesus, in the Garden of Gethsemane. It said that his heart was troubled. Now, whether you want to say he was afraid or not, it says that his heart was troubled. And it was good for that encouragement, even for Jesus. And so Paul, he does need that encouragement. You go to other places where it talks about that he prayed 3 times for the thorn in his flesh, and that, he was weak and he needed that help, which is why he continued to pray. But God would have, Jesus would have came to him and said, my grace is sufficient enough for you. Thank you for that. Yes, sir.
And Paul wasn't a stranger to this either. In Acts 14, he was dragged out of the city.
Yeah.
He was stoned, and they thought he was dead. Then in 16, he was beaten and beaten pretty badly
Mm-hmm.
in prison. So he might have been seeing the exact same scenarios manifest.
Yes, sir.
He's like, oh no, there comes another beat.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean,
Or knowing his thoughts and his concerns, he reassured him.
yeah. I mean, if you just look at the amount of times he would beat, one, he was stoned to the point that they thought he was dead. I don't think anyone's gonna just not bat an eye and say, "Oh boy, I'm not scared of this." This is something serious. And if Paul is seeing that pattern of these things and that this is probably going to happen again, I mean, he has a reason to be afraid. But that won't mean that he won't stop, but he'll continue on to preach. All right, moving forward, beginning in verse 21. It says and actually, no, before that. So we see that he would take his leave after the judgment from Gallio, that he would take his leave in verse 18. It says, Paul, having remained many days longer, took leave of the brethren and put out to sea for Syria. And with him were Priscilla and Aquila. In Centuria, he had cut his hair, for he was keeping a vow. Now, we are not told what this vow is. There are some that think that this was a Nazirite vow, to where you had to grow your hair out. And if you promised something to God, that you would keep it. And afterwards, after it would be completed, that then you would cut your hair off. And then after you cut your hair off, you were supposed to bring it to the altar in Jerusalem, in the holy city, and burn it. But so that is just some that people may think, whatever this vow was, if Paul would have, conducted this, it wasn't him saying that it had nothing to do with his salvation. It was just something that he would continue to do. He probably, wanted to do this to kind of subject himself to relate more to the Jews, if you will. So we don't really know what the vow is. It's just speculation, and speculation again is just speculation. But after he does this, it says that they came to, yes, sir.
If it was a Nazarite vow, it couldn't have lasted over a week because you couldn't drink grape juice and you couldn't take it to the Lord's Supper. Just a thought.
That's a good thought.
Nazarite vow.
Yeah. And so that's why I say I won't settle on it being a Nazirite vow, but that's just what some people, conclude. And so as he goes, it says that Paul himself in verse 19 would have entered the synagogues in Ephesus to reason with the Jews. But he doesn't stay long, because he ends up saying to them that God willing that he'll be back. And so he leaves to Caesarea, which would have been a 500-mile journey. And as he says this in verse, let me see, in verse 21, notice he says, but taking leave of them and saying, I will return to you again if God wills. And so that's him submitting to God, the one being in control. And this would have been something that he would have had to realize even back in chapter 16. If you remember, he was trying to sail to places like Asia and Bithynia. But it would say that the Lord would have not permitted him to go to those places. And so he would have ended up going into Macedonia. And so even here we can see that Paul is saying, if God wills, that I will be back. He wants to be back there, but he understands that it is up to God, that God is the one that has to allow him to do that. In verse 23, it says, and having spent some time there, he left and passed successfully through the Galatian region and Phrygia, strengthening all the disciples. And this would begin his third missionary journey. We come to a character by the name of Apollos. It says that he was a Jew. He was from Alexandria by birth, and Alexandria would have been a pretty significant place in ancient history. It would have had a big library, the university. And with Apollos coming from this place, he would have been an eloquent man. He would have been well in speech. But it says that as he was speaking, it says he was mighty in scriptures. And it says in verse 25, this man had been instructed in the way of the Lord. And being fervent in spirit, he was speaking and teaching accurately the things concerning Jesus, being acquainted only with the baptism of John. Now, why was this a problem that he is talking about? He is preaching accurately the baptism, things concerning the baptism of John. Why is this a problem? Well, if you remember, John spoke of Jesus coming. We know that they both had the baptism there, that John baptized unto repentance. But he said, there's somebody coming after me that is going to baptize you with the Holy Spirit and with fire. And so this was a problem if Apollos was just preaching the baptism of John, because Jesus had already come. And so now we see that Priscilla and Aquila would have taught him the way of God more accurately, it would say in verse 26. And it's interesting because it puts Priscilla there first instead of Aquila. And I would say, we can kind of see from that Apollos, he was smart, but, he was taught by some tent makers. And both husband and wife would have instructed Paul. And a mention of Priscilla first may indicate that she would have taken the lead in this. And this would say, yes, the women are prohibited from exercising authority over a man and from teaching in the assembly, 1 Corinthians 14. But to say that they cannot teach a man is simply unscriptural. I have the example of me being taught the gospel. It was Sister Jones. She taught me the gospel. And afterwards, her husband would have came and he would have, kind of instructed me more so in that. So to say that a woman cannot teach a man is unscriptural. And so we see afterwards that Apollos, as he is taught right, he would have gone to Achaia and he would have gone to strengthen the brethren and refuted Jews in public. And the Greek term for convinced would mean that as he was refuting these Jews here, that he would throw down all the conversations that would have came his way. Again, Apollos he's mighty in the scriptures. And so we ought to continue to contend for the faith and do what we can. Thank you for your time, and Josh will pick up this upcoming Sunday.